analysis, therefore, labor appears to be the only essential of production. To replace capital is to replace nothing but the wages of the labor employed. Consequently, the whole of the surplus, after replacing wages, is profits. From this it seems to follow that the ratio between the wages of labor and the produce of that labor gives the rate of profit; and thus we arrive at Mr. Ricardo's principle that profits depend upon wages, rising as wages fall, and falling as wages rise. To protect this proposition, the most perfect form in which the law of profits seems to have been yet exhibited, against misapprehension, one or two explanatory remarks are required. If by wages be meant what constitutes the real affluence of the laborer, the quantity of produce which he receives in exchange for his labor, the proposition that profits vary inversely as wages will be obviously false. The rate of profit, as has been already observed and exemplified, does not depend upon the price of labor, but upon the proportion between the price of labor and the produce of it. If the produce of labor is large, the price of labor may also be large without any diminution in the rate of profit; and in fact the rate of profit is highest in those countries, as for example North America, where the laborer is most highly remunerated. For the wages of labor, though so large, bear a less proportion to the abundant produce of labor there than elsewhere. But this does not affect the truth of Mr. Ricardo's principle as he himself understood it, because an increase in the laborer's real comforts was not considered by him as a rise of wages. In his language, wages were only said to rise when they rose not in mere quantity but in value. To the laborer himself, he would have said, the quantity of his remuneration is the important circumstance, but its value is the only thing of importance to the person who purchases his labor. The rate of profits depends not upon absolute or real wages, but upon the value of wages. If, however, by value Mr. Ricardo had meant exchangeable value, this proposition would still have been remote from the truth. Profits depend no more upon the exchangeable value of the laborer's remuneration than upon its quantity. The truth is, that by the exchangeable value is meant the quantity of commodities which the laborer can purchase with his wages; so that when we say the exchangeable value of wages, we say their quantity under another name. Mr. Ricardo, however, did not use the word value in the sense of exchangeable value. Occasionally, in his writings, he could not avoid using the word as other people use it, to denote a value in exchange; but he more frequently employed it in a sense peculiar to himself, to denote cost of production; in other words, the quantity of labor required to produce the article, that being his criterion of cost of production. Thus, if a hat could be made with 10 days' labor in France and with 5 days' labor in England, he said that the value of a hat was double in France of what it was in England. If a quarter of corn could be produced a century ago with half as much labor as is necessary at present, Mr. Ricardo said that the value of a quarter of corn had doubled. Mr. Ricardo, therefore, would not have said that wages had risen, because a laborer could obtain 2 pecks of flour instead of 1 for a day's labor. But if last year he received for a day's labor something which required 8 hours' labor to produce it, and this year something which requires 9 hours, then Mr. Ricardo would say that wages had risen. A rise of wages, with Mr. Ricardo, meant an increase in the cost of production of wages, an increase in the number of hours' labor which go to produce the wages of a day's labor, an increase in the proportion of the fruits of labor which the laborer receives for his own share, an increase in the ratio between the wages of his labor and the produce of it. This is the theory, the reasoning of which it is the result has been given in the preceding paragraphs. Some of Mr. Ricardo's followers, or more properly, of those who have adopted in most particulars the views of political economy which his genius was the first to open up, have given explanation of Mr. Ricardo's doctrine to nearly the same effect as the above, but in rather different means. They have said that profits depend not on absolute, but on proportional wages, which they expound to mean the proportion which the labourers en masse receive of the total produce of the country. It seems, however, to be rather an unusual and inconvenient use of language to speak of anything as depending upon the wages of labour, and then to explain that by wages of labour you do not mean the wages of an individual labourer, but of all the labourers in the country collectively. Mankind will never agree to call anything a rise in wages except a rise in the wages of individual labourers, and it is therefore preferable to employ language tending to fix attention upon the wages of the individual. The wages, however, on which profits are said to depend are undoubtedly proportional wages, namely, the proportional wages of one labourer, that is, the ratio between the wages of one labourer and, not the whole produce of the country, but the amount of what one labourer can produce, the amount of that portion of the collective produce of the industry of the country which may be considered as corresponding to the labour of one individual labourer. Proportional wages, thus understood, may be concisely termed the cost of production of wages, or more concisely still, the cost of wages, meaning their cost in the original purchase money, labour. We have now arrived at a distinct conception of Mr. Ricardo's theory of profits in its most perfect state, and this theory we conceive to be the basis of the true theory of profits. All that means to do is to clear it from certain difficulties which still surround it, and which, though a greater degree apparent than real, are not to be put aside as wholly imaginary. Though it is true that tools, materials, and buildings, it is to be wished that there were some compact designation for all these essentials of production taken together, are themselves the produce of labour, and are only on that account to be ranked among the expenses of production. Yet the whole of their value is not resolvable into the wages of the labourers by whom they were produced. The wages of those labourers were paid by a capitalist, and that capitalist must have the same profit upon his advances as any other capitalist. When, therefore, he sells the tools or materials, he must receive from the purchaser not only the reimbursement of the wages he has paid, but also as much more as will afford him the ordinary rate of profit. And when the producer, after buying the tools and employing them in his own occupation, comes to estimate his gains, he must set aside a portion of the produce to replace not only the wages paid both by himself and by the tool maker, but also the profits of the tool maker advanced by himself out of his own capital. It is not correct, therefore, to state that all which the capitalist retains after replacing wages forms his profit. It is true, the whole return to capital is either wages or profits, but profits do not compose merely the surplus after replacing the outlay. They also enter into the outlay itself. Capital is expended partly in paying or reimbursing wages, and partly in paying the profits of other capitalists whose concurrence was necessary in order to bring together the means of production. If any contrivance, therefore, were devised by which that part of the outlay which consists of previous profits could be either wholly or partially dispensed with, it is evident that more would remain as the profit of the immediate producer, while as the quantity of labour necessary to produce a given quantity of the commodity would be unaltered, as well as the quantity of produce paid for that labour. It seems that the ratio between the price of labour and its produce would be the same as before, but the cost of production of wages would be the same, proportional wages the same, and yet profits different. To illustrate this by a simple instance, Let it be supposed that one third of the produce is sufficient to replace the wages of the